Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Crumbly. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'll be your narrator on this module entitled Projections and Transference. This module is one of 5 modules that have been put together for a course entitled Engaging Relative Caregivers, Managing Risk Factors in Kinship Care. You're about to see a clip of me doing training with professionals addressing several issues in kinship care. The first will be, what are the cues and sources of projection and transference experienced by caregivers? What are the goals, approaches, and scripts you might be able to use with caregivers in helping them manage their projections and transference? And number 3, what are the differences in projection and transference between kinship caregivers and non-relative foster parents and adoptive parents? And there are 2 questions that I'd like you and the viewing audience to ask as well. The first one is, how does projection and transference impact a relative caregiver's ability to provide permanency, safety, and protection? And the second question is, what goals and approaches will be useful in your practice with relative caregivers? So please sit back, relax, and I'll rejoin you at the conclusion of this video clip so we can summarize the training. Thank you. Projection and transference. I'd like you to be part of this experiential situation. I'd like you to think about a child in your family. I'd like you to now think about who that child reminds you of. I'd now like you to think about how is that child similar to the person that they remind you of. I want you to now think about how you feel about that person that they remind you of. And now I want you to think about how you feel about that child. Now, tell me how you feel about the child. Manipulative. Protective. Loved. Angry. Warmth. Nervous. Scared. Admiration. Okay. Guilty. Intelligent. Conniving. Happy. Talented. Unequipped. Creative. Sad. Okay. What you just did and what you just went through is what relative caregivers go through when they look at the children in their care. They see a child, that child reminds them of someone in the family. They then think about how that child is similar to that member of the family. That then triggers how they feel about that family member and eventually impacts how they feel about who? The child. Projection and transference can become a safety, permanency, and well-being issue if that relative caregiver does not like the person that the child reminds them of. If they don't like that person that the child reminds them of, then there's a potential that they may not be providing adequate protection, permanency, and well-being. That's why projection is so important in kinship care. What are the sources of projection and transference? Unresolved issues with the birth parent. Difficult perceiving the child as separate from the birth parents. They're looking at the birth parents as an extension, looking at the child as an extension of the birth parent. Anticipating and being fearful of the child repeating the same mistakes as the birth parents. Another source of fear is feeling unable to cope with the interruption and the repetition of this birth parent's behavior. Am I going to be able to make a difference? Can I cope with it happening all over again? Unresolved personal issues about the choices and mistakes and behaviors transferred to the child. That has nothing to do with birth parents. It has to do with, am I going to see myself in this child? And is this child going to repeat the mistakes that I made growing up? And then difficulties knowing the difference between what are developmental issues from what's genetics. What's your developmental issues from DNA? What's the developmental issues from the child being like the birth parents? Trying to make that distinction. Here are the cues to let you know they might be dealing with projection and transference. You're just like your mom. just like your dad. Your dad hurt me and embarrassed the family the same way you are and will. You're already projecting that the child is going to do it in advance. This is a script that's specific to aunts and uncles. I'm not going to let you put me through what your mom put your parents through, my parents through, and before I do, I may hurt you, I may put you out. So it's the threat, not just the thought, but it's the threat. Another cue, I'm not going to put up with you the same way I did with your dad. That could be an aunt or uncle or grandparent saying that. And before I do, here's the threat. That lets you know that there might be a red flag. I'm not going to make the same mistakes with you that I made in my life and with your parents. Now the source is becoming intergenerational. They're thinking about what they didn't do with the birth parents as well as what they did with themselves, and not being transferred to that child. And the last one is not being sure. Don't say anything, don't say another word. You're about to lie like your dad did when he was a teenager. They're already projecting what this child is going to do it before the child does it. So what do we do? What are our goals? Number one, helping relative caregivers avoid recreating the monster and the self-fulfilling prophecy. Number two, feeling unable to interrupt cycles and influence the child's behavior. Can I make a difference? Is the question. Number three, being able to provide the child the skills and the opportunities and the resources to make choices different from the birth parents. And that becomes important because you just can't say to the child, change, don't be like mom and dad. How do I do it? How do you help them do that? And that's what that's all about, providing the resources and opportunities. Encourage the child to develop their own personality. You may not be able to choose your parents, but you can certainly choose what choices you make. That's what you want the children to become aware of, and that's what you want them to be thinking of when they're developing their own personalities. Highlight the positive aspects of those parents for the children, because we know they're going to model. You know they're going to make that attachment. You know they're going to identify with that birth parent. And then protect the child from conversations about the birth parent resulting from your unresolved issues. For that relative caregiver, you can't belittle. You can't put mom and dad down. You've got to look at what your issues are and separate that from the child. And lastly, not using the child's behavior as an excuse for not having to make change. He's the problem, she's the problem, fix them. And if they're the problem, then I don't have to look at what I need to do differently. That's called scapegoating. So what do you do? How do you do that? Avoiding the relative caregivers from recreating the monster. The buy-in there is getting relative caregivers to not want to be the cause or the excuse for the children repeating the mistakes of their parents. That's the buy-in. So they'll need to hear you say things like, if the child keeps hearing you say things, if the child keeps hearing you saying that they're like their parents, then they may use what you're saying as an excuse to behave like their parents. You don't want to hear the child saying, I can't stop what I'm doing because grandmom said I was always like my dad. I can't help but be bad because I'm just like who? My mom or my dad. And then when you ask the child, where did you hear that at? Oh, grandma. Interrupting cycles. The buy-in for relative caregiver is feeling as though they can make a difference. That's the buy-in. You can make a difference. Even if you feel as though the birth parents can't make a difference, you can make a difference. So that's why that piece now about the child needs to know about the lessons you've learned, choices and that have changed and made your life differently so that you're who you are today. The child's going to need to know what changes that their parents are trying to make. Even if the parents fail, can't get through rehab, it's knowing that the parents are trying. That becomes the issue there. And then providing the opportunities, skills, and resources that will provide the child the tools and equipment so that they can do things differently. And then these last two, here we're talking about changing legacies, interrupting cycles. But you may have to, I think it's important that you remember that you may be asking relative caregivers to do things for that child that they didn't do with who? Their own. And to do things with that child that wasn't done for who? That's breaking the cycles. That's the legacy. This next goal, self-images, and how to help the child identify with the birth parent, the motivation there is, if you don't want the child to think, when you put down the birth parents, and if the child thinks that you don't like their birth parents, they then may think that you don't like who? Yeah, that's the motivation. It's the motivation of wanting to preserve their relationship with the child. That's the motivation to then talk about, they need to hear about the positive characteristics and talents and events in their parents' life. They need to hear about what you liked about their parents. They need to hear about what were the potential talents that were similar to the parents that they now have. And they need to hear how they can use those talents to be different from their birth parents. But it all starts from that relative caregiver being concerned about being able to make that child feel that you like them and not take the chance of the child feeling as though, well, if you don't like my mom, then you may not like me. And consequently, it interrupts their relationship. Avoid the child triangulating. Now, there are three things relative caregivers need to do in order for that to happen. They have to give the children permission to love and be loyal to the birth parent. They have to make the children feel safe and to know that they're not going to lose the relative caregiver if they do that. And then they also need to have examples of how to love, how to recognize. Now, the problem with that is you've got to be able to do those three things when a relative caregiver doesn't like who? The birth parent, right? Yeah, that's the part. So when we look at what's going to motivate them to do that, it's that second bullet. You don't want to be accused by the children or by the parents of coming between them. You don't want to be scapegoated. That's usually what's going to motivate them to do these things that we're talking about here. So you can even start that off as a preliminary statement. You don't want to be accused by the children or their parents of coming between them. And so that you don't want to be accused of that, then you need to know, the children need to know that you won't be angry or hurt if they love their parents, even if you and the parents don't get along. They need to know that you will allow and demonstrate how they can care for their parents and not feel betrayed. That's making the children safe, and it keeps them from not feeling triangulated. So, let's look at implications for practice. When we look at relative caregivers, what's important to understand is that they have a pre-existing relationship with who? The birth parent. And that pre-existing relationship and those feelings can impact how they feel about the child. They have past memories with that birth parent that can affect how they're feeling about the child. They have shared legacies with that child that have to do with incarceration or drugs and alcohol or domestic violence or going to college or becoming educated or becoming professionals. It's a shared legacy. For a non-relative caregiver, there's no pre-existing relationship, so there's no pre-existing memories. For non-relative caregivers, there's no past memories that get carried over because there was no interaction. And there's no shared legacies. They may have similar legacies with that child, but they don't share it with that child because they don't share anything with who? The birth parents. Exactly. So here's your work. You need to assess with relative caregivers what about that child they like and dislike. You need to assess with those relative caregivers who that child reminds them of. And you need to assess with the caregivers how that's going to impact their ability to protect and care for the child. So you're going to have to ask assessment questions that are real direct. Who's that child remind you of? Do you like who that child reminds you of? Do you have any concerns about this child being similar and like that birth parent? And if the child turns out like the birth parent, are you still going to do what? Keep them. That's the ultimate question. But you still keep them if they turn out like mom and dad. So you use your assessment questions to do that. You then have to work with that relative caregiver to understand why they're projecting. Why are they not liking that child? What about their feelings of that birth parent makes them not like the child? And more importantly, how does the child trigger their feelings about that birth parent. And how does that child trigger and impact their ability to provide permanency, protection, and well-being? You then have to follow that up with giving relative caregivers the scripts. Remember, those scripts and dialogues become their monologues with themselves in terms of how to control their projection and their transfer. That scripts also are scripts that they can use with guess who? The child. So providing the scripts, doing the assessments, making them aware of what's triggering them, and then how to manage and control it, that's safety, permanency, and projection in kinship care. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Annie E. Casey for allowing me this opportunity to present, and I'd like to thank you for coming out to being part of this training. Hello, welcome back. Let's summarize the training in the video that you just saw. Our first question that we tried to address in the training was, what are the cues and sources of projection and transference experienced by the relative caregivers? Those sources may be unresolved issues that they have with the birth parents that they're now carrying over to the child. Another source is not feeling as though that they can make a difference in the fear of repeating those same mistakes that they did with the birth parent, now that they're going to do with the child. Another source of the projection might be the fact that they may be influencing the child because of who they are, and that they might be repeating the same mistakes with that child that have nothing to do with the birth parents. Another source of projection and transference may have to do with the fact that the relative caregiver may be feeling as though, I can't make a difference, or I can't cope. They're saying to themselves, oh no, not again. A second time around, I can't handle it. So it's those kinds of issues that can result in having those issues of projection. The cues you want to listen for are, you're just like your mom, you're just like your dad. I'm not going to let you put me through what I saw you put my mother through. I'm not going to let you put me through what I went through with your mom. And before I do, I will. So it's when you hear those kind of statements, and then when you hear the threat, and you're not sure if the threat's going to be physical, emotional, you've got an at-risk situation at your hands. So what are your goals? Helping relative caregivers not recreate the monster by saying to the child over and over again, you're like who? Your mom, your dad. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and if the children hear it long enough and over and over again, then they do act it out. Getting the relative caregivers to feel as though they can make a difference, that they can change things for that child, that they can make an impact, and being comfortable using their experiences, even if they can't relate to mom and dad, what things have changed your life and have made things different for you. So getting relative caregivers to avoid scapegoating the child by saying that the child's the problem so that they don't have to address the need to change. It's getting relative caregivers to look at how they're now going to raise these children from the way they raised their own and from the way they were raised. Your scripts are important. The children need to know how you feel about the birth parent. They need to know how you feel about them. And you have to make sure that the children know that I will still love you even if you love who? Your family. I will still be here for you even if you connect with them. I won't leave you and feel betrayed if you're connected with the parents. And then showing them how to still connect with those parents. Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to say thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Annie E. Casey for giving me this opportunity to present. And I hope this material will be useful in your practice.